All right, guys, a thought for you on this rainy Friday morning. Satan doesn't need you to worship him. He just needs you to not worship God. Satan's perfectly fine with you worshiping a million other things as long as you don't worship God. You can worship sex, you can worship drugs, you can worship entertainment, you can worship pleasure, you can worship your family, you can worship your spouse, you can worship nature, you can worship knowledge. But here's the diabolical thing. You can also worship the things of God instead of God. If you don't think that's true, look at the history of Israel, read the Old Testament. They worshipped the temple, they worshipped the priesthood, they worshipped the law, they worshipped the ark, they worshipped the things of God instead of God. And because of that, the things of God for them became an idol. So you can also worship your church, your pastor, your favorite theologian, the Bible, your knowledge of Scripture, instead of God. Satan's fine if you're a Christian. He's fine if you're worshiping biblical knowledge. He's fine if you're worshiping a self-righteous superiority. That's great. He loves that. The only thing that Satan is afraid of is when you truly fall on your face and worship God. So, the question is, how do you know when you are worshiping God? In Romans chapter 8, Paul says, the Spirit says to our spirits that we are the sons of God. And he also says, we know we are children of God by the Spirit he has placed within us. Okay? I think this is a clue and a key. How do you know you're worshiping God? The answer really is prayer. This is worship, guys. I worship in my truck. I worship while I'm painting. I worship while I'm working. I worship in the woods. I also worship in church. I also worship when I'm hearing a good sermon that is really piercing into me. But guess what is all of that? And how is all of that worship? And how can all of that also be idolatry? When you're worshiping yourself in the midst of all of that, that's idolatry. The biggest idol that you will ever encounter is yourself. How are you worshiping self over God? Well, here's how. Oh gosh, that worship made me feel so good. Oh, that sermon was so convicting. If I just felt so good hearing that sermon. I felt so good with that worship song in the car on the way to work. I got so much out of reading Scripture. I felt so good. It felt so good for me. It is so good for me, God. I love it because you do so many things for me. Well, who are you worshiping, guys, in the midst of all those things? Yourself. God, if your worship is God makes me feel so good, and it's about God making me feel good, who are you worshiping? Here's true worship. When I am praying, encountering God, in communion with God, and it focuses me on God. God, I'm so thankful that you're with me. God, I'm so convicted right now by your Spirit in this area. God, guys, the presence of God can make you feel bad just as much as good, and that is worship. Worship is I am communing with God through his Spirit. And my focus is God, not myself, and not what God does for me or how God makes me feel. Worship is prayer, is I'm interacting with God, and my focus is God. What's the focus in everything you're doing? Is it yourself or is it God? In my communion with God, my focus is God. I'm talking with God. I'm praying. I have a sense of God's presence. That is true worship, when you have a sense of God's presence and when your focus is God. And because God's presence will draw you to God. If God's not there, you'll be worshiping anything but God. That's idolatry. So, it is an internal sense, but it is an external manifestation. So what are you talking about all the time? talking about how good God is? Are you talking about how good your church is? Are you talking about how good God is? Or are you talking about how good your pastor is? Are you talking about the truth that God has shown you personally? Or are you talking about the truth that your pastor has taught you, or your church, or your own understanding? Like, what is your focus in everything? And as you engage with God and really feel the presence of God, what is that drawing you towards yourself? God. Okay. You know, it's not always easy actually to tell, and that's fine. But what does David say? Search me, O God, know my heart, see if there is any unclean way in me. Examine. We examine our thoughts. This is contemplation. It is, I need to examine myself before God, not using my own understanding and rationale and judgments and knowledge of Scripture or anything. I come before God and I say, God, here we are together, examine me. It's not me examining myself on behalf of God, or helping, or someone else examining me on behalf of God. It is me and God. And God, I'm saying, God, search my heart. See if there's any unclean way in me. And then I'm opening myself up. And I'm listening, and I'm in a posture of quietness. I'm trying to, and that takes time too. And that's an effort, and that's work. But then I am in this place, in this posture of saying, God, examine me. And then I'm listening. What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What's coming up? What thoughts are coming to my mind? What feelings are coming to my heart? How am I even feeling physically? And what are these things speaking to me in the moment? And what is God saying through those things? That is how we begin to examine ourselves in the midst of worship, in the midst of prayer, in the midst of our participation with God, to see whether or not it is actually God we are participating with, or the God of self. Okay? Just some encouragement, guys. Like, don't take it for granted. Don't think, well, I felt so good and that was worship. That made me feel good. And you might be worshiping yourself. You might be trying to use God to do it. All right. I'm here. See ya.